In this video, I'm going to show you how to create your own medieval authentic paint to turn your shield into a work of art. In 2017, I built a replica Viking shield based on my research, the making of which is documented in a number of videos which you will find in the respective playlist on this channel. In this video, I'm going to guide you step by step through the process of making your own paint, authentic paint, how to apply it to your shield, and also how to add additional coatings to protect the painting. I will also share with you some of the experiences that I made over the course of 3 years. I am actually very happy and still very content with the painting, with the result of the painting and how it held up in hundreds of fights. If you follow my work, you know that I suggest that in close combat, the Viking shield, the flat center grip ground shield, was actually used quite aggressively, actively as a weapon. And that means that in the practice fights that I had in the past 3 years, there was a lot of contact on the shield surface. So all this contact, of course, rubbed off some of the paint, but it still looks pretty nice. It's also interesting to see that the painting was damaged most in those spots, in those parts which were exposed to opposing shield contact. My shield is painted with egg tempera exclusively. There is no grounding of gesso. Gesso consists of chalk, which is a mineral, kind of a limestone, plus hide glue, plus white pigment, and it is generally used with later shields, that is high medieval and particularly late medieval shields. Those shields in Marburg, they generally have a grounding of gesso, but I have reason to assume that because gesso is a very brittle material, they are not so well suited for a shield that vibrates a lot, and the rather big but thin boards of Viking shields do vibrate when they get hit. When you want to create a replica shield of the 15th century or the High Middle Ages, there's a lot of material that you can use as a basis for the motifs that you choose to put onto your shield. There are plenty of period depictions in manuscripts, and then there are a couple of surviving artifacts, real shields that can even be seen today in museum collections. As for the early Middle Ages, there's a Tony knot, there's Frankish art, but when you are a Viking enthusiast, there's not all too much to go by, save for 2 tiny fragments from supposed shields, and one comes from the Isle of Man, and it shows a black stripe with red dots on a white background. That's it. And then we have some kind of interlace motif on a tiny fragment from some other wooden board, which is supposed to be the remains of a Viking shield. A few words on pigments. You can either purchase them from art supplies, this is what I do, or you can make them yourself. There are some historical recipes provided by Theophilus Presbyter, who wrote in about 1100, and his treatise is actually available online. It's called De Diversis Artibus, about the various arts. He, for instance, describes how to create verdigris. It's basically copper rust. It's the stuff that I use to paint my shield green in some parts, and you can do that according to Theophilus by putting some strips of sheet metal, copper sheet metal, into an oaken box. Then you burn some salt overnight, you grind it, and you put some twigs over the sheet metal, then you pour the salt on top, and you also put some honey there. Then you seal the whole thing with a lid, and there's a hole in the lid, and you pour some urine or some vinegar in that, and then you bury it, and 4 weeks later you can harvest your copper rust. Or you just order it from an art supplier. There are pigments which are toxic. Copper rust is one of them. Also lead white, they are historical pigments, so take utmost care. The stuff is super, super fine. This, for instance, here is a ferro oxide. It's basically rust. So if you have access to a forge, you can go there and collect a lot of the stuff that is actually used to produce pigments. Black ferro oxides would be another one that any smith can easily get access to. And all this stuff is super, super fine. So make sure that you seal it and put it into jars like I do. And also make sure that children don't have access to it. As I said, a lot of the stuff is toxic. This is not true for some of the minerals, like for instance, this material here. This is dust which was produced by a friend of mine when he cut up hundreds of historical bricks to turn them into tiles. And then the dust, there was buckets full of it, I collected and used it as a pigment. In fact, I used it to paint the walls of a room in our house. Here is another ferro oxide. This is a yellow one. And all the pigment is extremely yielding. It lasts forever. This stuff I purchased in the late 1980s when I was a student and studying at Art Academy. So I still have plenty left. You will see in the video how yielding that material actually is. When you're purchasing pigments, make sure that you get natural ones, or at least pigments that are made in a historical manner. There are also modern ones. They are usually chromium based, and I strongly advise against them because they're both toxic and they're not authentic. You can also use egg tempera to paint leather. I have used it on a scabbard of mine, and I covered the egg tempera painting, the pattern that I painted onto that scabbard, with a coating, with a varnish that is made from egg white, and this is something that I'm going to show you in the video too. Alright, now, so here is how you do it. I'm now going to prepare egg tempera. So tempera paint has been used for millennia, and the egg is a fantastic binding agent. An egg generally consists of 12% protein, 12% oil, and most of the rest is water. You can actually just use the contents of a complete egg and just put it in a glass, close the glass and shake it up and start painting instantly. What I want to do, I want to use the egg yolk as a binding agent, and then the egg white, the clear stuff, I'm going to use to create a varnish. So carefully open your egg. I try to not cut open the yolk, because the yolk itself is in the skin. You can see that here are some whitish strands. There's a lump of less translucent, less clear material here. It's also on the other side. These were the strands that kept the yolk within the shell, much like a punching ball. And now that the egg has been opened, they just shrivel. This stuff is what I'm going to use to create my varnish later on. Now I'm going to try to cut open the yolk, to only use the contents of the yolk. So I'm cutting open the skin, and the yellow stuff flows out. I don't know if the camera can catch it. You don't have to go through all that pain.
As I said, you can just use the complete egg. You can get rid of the slimy stuff here later on when you are mixing your colors. I'm going to open yet another egg. Which I'm now going to cut open. Okay, so this is actually ready for mixing your colors. So later on I will show you how I do it. All I need now is pigments, and then I'm going to thin it with water. Mind you that if you're using egg tempera, this is not going to last forever. So at one point this is going to start to rot, and then it's going to smell really, really bad. I have read in some books on paints and paintings that you can still use it, but I reckon that I'm going to use up all of this anyway. Alright, now for preparing the varnish, which is called Chlorea, in German Eikläre. And what you do is put it into a container. And now you have to stir it until it becomes all foamy. Okay, so I have now whisked the egg white stiff. Now I need a sieve. I'm going to put all of the stiff, foamy egg white into the sieve. I will need this container again. Because I will put the sieve onto this container and leave it overnight. So this is what I'm going to leave overnight, and then tomorrow my varnish, my Chlorea, is going to be in this container. So overnight, the glare has dropped from the stiff foam. This is the stuff I wanted. So here's my Chlorea, glare, or in German Eikläre. You should keep it in the fridge too, because it will rot at one point. With this stuff, some of the old masters wrote that it really becomes most excellent when it starts to smell like hell. Yeah, that's a matter of taste. You can just as well cast it away when it starts to rot. This will be thinned with water, and then it's going to be used as a varnish on my egg tempera painting. Egg tempera by nature is a rather matte and dull kind of color once it has dried. If you add some varnish like this, like Chlorea, like glare, then it will get a nicer and deeper and richer appearance, and the painting will also be sealed. The front side has now been roughened with sandpaper. Sandpaper, of course, is a modern invention. The skin of Ray would be an appropriate means of roughening the surface so that the paint will stick better to the hide. I have also made a stencil now, and this is half the side of 1/4 of the design, and it is based on a big picture stone from Norway, from Dura, I think. So I'm next going to draw the design onto the board. So this is how much I could paint with the amount of color you saw me preparing earlier, and that's about half the shield regarding the red. Of course I have to do all the fine contours later on, but just to give you an idea of how much paint or how little paint you actually need. So I have left the shield overnight for the red paint to dry, and I'm going to add green. So I'm going to use this Verdigris Grünspan stuff that is made from copper. This is poisonous, so keep it well out of the reach of children, and make sure that when you use it, you don't want to spill any of this, and you definitely don't want to inhale any of the pigment dust. And also I advise to not chew on your shield edge, berserker style, once you have painted it with poisonous paint. So once again, I'm going to use the egg yolk. I kept this jar in the fridge, so to make sure that it doesn't start to rot. This looks very translucent, so I'm going to add some more pigment. So this color behaves quite differently on the brush. So as I emphasize the outlines, you can see that I keep twisting and rolling the brush in my hand so that the pigment is transported to the outside. Because I want to make sure that the outline is the darkest area here. So I want enough pigment to produce exactly that effect. And then I can gently spread the pigment, painting from the outside inside to the inside. The color will look somewhat differently once it is dried. It's going to have a richer and more pleasing appearance. So because the edge strip was of a darker color than the hide that I put onto the shield front as a facing, I gave the outer edge a second coating of white so that it looks much the same as the white further to the inside of the shield, like this one here. With medieval shields, what you usually do is you would have a grounding of gesso, and then you would paint onto this white background. I have done that before with a Viking Age shield. It's actually the one over there in the corner. For two reasons it came off in flakes. Partially because it was my mistake to not roughen up the surface of the hide. I should have given it a much coarser surface for the paint to stick. But also because this one is made from split planks too, it means that it does have this distinct flex when it is being hit, which means that a rather stiff material like gesso would start to shatter and eventually come off. So I've now mixed some ultramarine, which is made from crushed lapis lazuli. I think in English that's what? Lapis lazuli? I don't know how you pronounce it. Anyway, it's a mineral that is being crushed, and I lightened it up with a little bit of lead white, and now I have added some vermilion, which is another toxic color, another toxic pigment. So again, don't inhale any of this stuff, and make sure it is kept out of reach of children. Another question that regularly comes up in regards to historical shields, particularly some of the lavishly ornamented medieval shields, which sometimes are not only painted but have decoration sculpted in low relief on the shield. There's a most extraordinary example which has an eagle sculpted to the board, and with the eagle head looking at you. And whenever people see shields like that, surviving shields like this, they say like, are these really for combat? Aren't they rather for presentational purposes, like parading or so? I always say yes and no, because presentation, showing who you are, showing how wealthy you are, how rich you are, and impressing your opponent on the field, that's part of warfare too. When you are summoned and you have to show up in front of your lord to join the host, to join his army, you also want to make an impression on your peers. So you would go in your Sunday best. And in fact, your overlord would probably expect you to as well, so that when there are negotiations, people in his retinue are supposed to look impressive, to leave an impression on the enemy.
In fact, there's actually no indication that ornate shields were not used in combat. If we look at contemporary art, then men-at-arms campaigning or in actions are using exactly the same shields that we can see in museum collections as surviving artifacts today. There also are some shields, while not from the Middle Ages but from late antiquity, namely the 3rd century, which were found at Dura-Europos in Syria, which were left in action. So there are collapsed stone walls after a siege, and shields were found on that site, and they were just as elaborately and lavishly decorated as those that we do see in Roman art too. So at least for these we can say these shields were used in combat despite them being meticulously painted and excellently crafted. That's a pretty crazy shield decoration, and I'm going to leave it to dry until tomorrow, and then I'm going to attach a varnish. So now I'm going to put some varnish on the painting of the shields. The idea of putting on a varnish is twofold. First of all, it's supposed to create a protective coating, but secondly, it also is supposed to add more depth to the colors. As it is now, there are some colors that are slightly glossy, a bit shiny, and then others that appear to be rather dull, and the coating will help to remedy this and make the shield look even nicer. So this is my glare. The coating, don't stir it or shake it, because it, as you can see, if it moves it's going to produce bubbles, and the whole process we went through was partially to get rid of any such bubbles. So anyway, I'm now going to add the varnish. Make sure that the brush that you use, that is free of any pigment or any remains of paint, because glare is a binder too, so you can actually use it in the same fashion as I used the yolk earlier on. So if you wish to paint with glare, you can do that too, right? But in this case, I'm going to use it as a varnish. I'm not going to thin it down. I mean, this is the glare from 2 eggs. The whole shield was painted using 2 yolks only, as it felt like the varnish could be a little bit thinner, so a thinner consistency would work better in terms of distributing it on the shield and applying it. I'm going to thin down my varnish with some water now, maybe a third of water to add to the varnish, and I'm also keeping some water to clean and rinse my brush. Now, as I apply it, I have to make sure that I don't brush over the surface too much, because I just noted that it would open up the color again, and I don't want to. Oh, that feels better. And I don't want to smear the painting, of course. So it's probably better to rather apply 2 layers of varnish, 2 thin layers, than brushing over the same spot too often and smearing the color. So it turned out that for some reason the iron oxide, if I go over it with the varnish, that's the color that tends to smear. So I first go over all the ornaments that are not red. So that's the spaces that I left blank, the light spaces here, and of course all the green parts. And then for the second round, I'm going to varnish the iron oxide. And as I said, it's probably better to do 2 coatings, and it feels like I have plenty. So the water really helps to apply the varnish. It's much nicer to put it on now than it was before. But there's plenty, so 2 eggs, they are absolutely sufficient. So now I'm going to do the edge. And again, I'm going color by color, so I'm going to first paint the violet parts of the decorative braid, or rather coat. Because this is a liquid, there's a chance that this is going to have an impact on the hide, so it may start to wrinkle again. I don't know if it's going to dissolve and loosen up the glue, but we will find out. So I've applied a first coating of varnish, and I'm going to leave it to dry for an hour or 2 before I'm going to add a second coating and then see how glossy or shiny it will turn out in the end. It definitely did add depth to the colors. You may note that the liquid, the moisture of the color, also produced some wrinkles again, but I expect these to settle once the varnish has dried. Pretty much the same happened during painting 2. The effect of the colors is indeed a lot more pleasing now. There are no dull spots anymore, but let us see what it looks like in 2 hours' time. I have added a final second layer of varnish, and because of the liquid, some of the glue on the edge has opened again, and I will now iron it down again so that it sticks to the board nicely. So my shield is all painted, and I have applied a coating of glare to seal the painting. Finally, I'm going to apply a further coating of linseed oil, which is supposed to provide the shield with a water repellent coating. So this is the linseed oil that I bought from a supplier for artists. Linseed oil is made from the seeds of flax. Flax was grown in the north, actually all over Europe, ever since prehistoric times. We don't really know whether they made oil from it, but it's of course very likely. So you can see that this is actually quite viscous, and this is what I'm going to put onto the shield now. It's almost like its consistency is pretty much like honey. When you distribute the oil on your shield, make sure that you go with gentle strokes so that you don't harm the painting. Don't want to rub off anything now. And also use the reflection of the light to see how the oil is distributed on the shield, because you want an even coating, one that is preferably rather thin, because you don't want the oil to produce an undesired tension, surface tension of its own later on, so that when it dries it will never produce any cracks. And something that is really important too is, once you've done that, when you are finished with using linseed oil, this here is inflammable, and in fact, if you crumble it and throw it into a corner, and then the sun shines onto it, it may inflame. So it may burst in flames and cause rather unfortunate events. So make sure that any oil-filled rags, leave them in a space where there's sufficient air. Don't ever crumble them and throw them someplace where it's rather hot and dry.
So here's the shield. As you can see, it's shiny because of the oil coating, and of course it's still not dry. But what it also did is it gave the colors a very rich appearance and depth.
I'm now going to take the shield to a dry and light place. Surprisingly, when linseed oil dries, the 3 first days supposedly are very important in terms of lighting. So you want a place where there's indirect sunlight, as it does initiate a particular chemical reaction and positively influences the drying process. It also prevents that the oil gets too dark. Over time, linseed oil, you know this from oil paintings and museum old oil paintings, the oil does darken, so it does have a self-color. Also, when you get linseed oils, it comes in all kinds of qualities. Best if you buy it at a supplier for artists. They usually know about their products, I hope. So the last coating, the linseed oil, took probably 2 months or so to dry. This is something that you have to simply accept, that when you make something authentically, you need patience. For people like us, modern people who are used to instant gratification, this is hard to bear, but some humility, some humbleness to the art is part of making stuff the medieval way. One problem I encountered with this shield was that it had a tendency to warp when humidity changed. Particularly when it became dry, it started to warp to the front, because the parchment would lose humidity more easily than the wood, and so it shrank and pulled the wood towards the front. I store the shield where I made it. The shield really loves to live in that place rather than being in a heated room. This is something that everybody who uses implements made of wood, and that is solid wood, not plywood, knows very well. Like, for instance, wooden bows for authentic or for medieval archery, you want to keep them in a place which is not overly dry. Now the same goes for your replica shield, and I added another coating a couple of months ago, and this coating was not pure linseed oil, which is rather viscous, but something that is more like a fluid, and that is Leinölfirnis linseed varnish. I didn't make it myself. As you can see, I bought it in a hardware store, and this stuff penetrated the parchment, or at least I think it penetrated the parchment much more than the linseed oil did, and thus it created a more stable barrier against humidity, and ever since then I hardly have a problem with warpage. When I was at the Berlin Bucklerbouts, because the gym was heated, I kept the shield in the bathroom so that the steam from people taking a shower would relax the parchment as it absorbed some fluidity and the board remained straight. A final word about the color, about the paint and its susceptibility to humidity and moisture. Now, egg tempera dries on a chemical basis. So once you have painted your shield, you have to wait at least 3 weeks or so before you take it out to practice or into reenactment combat. All the watery ingredients will dry pretty quickly. However, as I told you, there's oil in the binding agent too, and that just takes a long time to dry. But once it has dried through, this is water resistant paint and it will not open again. So your egg tempera painting is in fact water resistant. Alright now, so I hope you enjoyed this rather extensive video and you are all up for making your beautiful shield by painting it with egg tempera. Thank you very much for your interest, and to all my patrons, thank you so much for your support via Patreon. Oh, and send me images, send me photos of shields that you have painted. I would really appreciate it.